Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the AIM on MS&T podcast. I'm your host, Kate, and I'm so glad you have joined us today. If you are new here, let's catch you up. AIM stands for Academia, Industry, and Military, which are the sectors that form the foundation of the modeling, simulation, and training community right here in Central Florida. Together, they make up what is known as Team Orlando, a collaborative partnership driving innovation and mission readiness through MS&T. Each episode, we sit down with leaders and innovators within the MS&T world to talk about what's new, what's next, and why it matters, especially to our Team Orlando community. Whether you're deep in the field or just curious about one of Orlando's biggest industries, second only to the theme parks and hospitality industry, we're here to keep you informed, inspired, and part of the conversation. This episode is brought to you in part by Capital Communications and Consulting, telling your story across all platforms with a clear focus and innovative impact. Whether you want to elevate your message, grow your presence, or connect with the right audience, the C3 team will help bring your story to life. Learn more at mycapitalcommunications.com. Today, our guest is Shawn Burke, Professor and Director of the Trace Lab at the Institute for Simulation and Training, University of Central Florida. TRACE stands for Team, Research, and Adaptability in Complex Environments. Thank you for joining us today. To get us started, can you please tell our audience a bit about yourself? Please walk us through your career journey and what led you to where you are now.
Sure. So I'm actually a UCF graduate. So I did my undergraduate here at UCF. And when I graduated, I was a bit undecided. I knew I wanted to do psychology. I knew I did not want to do clinical psychology, but I wasn't sure if I wanted to do human factors or industrial organizational psychology. So after I graduated with my bachelor's, I took a year and I worked over at TSD. And I worked over there with Dr. Eduardo Salas and Dr. Jan Cannon-Bowers. And they had two labs there, one that did more human factors related research and one that did more industrial organizational. So it was a really nice place for me to kind of get my feet wet and see what did I really want to do. I decided that I really liked the industrial organizational side. So after working there for about a year, I applied to graduate school, ended up at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia. So that's where I did my master's and my PhD. And while I was there, I worked as a consortium fellow for the Army Research Institute and kept in contact with everybody. And then when I graduated with my PhD around 2000, I decided I really wanted to come back to Florida. Dr. Salas had just made a transition from TSD over to UCF. And so we ran into each other on a plane and we were talking. And I said, yeah, I'd like to come back to Florida. He says, okay. He says, I've got, give me a little bit of time. I've got some, let me build up some funds. So I moved back here and applied to a couple different places and ultimately decided that I wanted to come work at the Institute for Simulation and Training with Ed because I felt that I would get more mentorship and just, more growth as a young graduate. So I started here in 2000. I worked with Ed for about 15 years until he left to go to Rice. And then I kind of took over our lab, which is now, I've renamed the Trace Lab since he's been gone. So I've been here, like I said, since about 2000. And now I run the lab and I have like about 4 or 5 graduate students that work with me. They're a mixture of, depends on the timing. Sometimes they're all industrial organizational PhD students. Sometimes there are also some human factors. We've had some modeling and simulation students. And sometimes they're master's students. Sometimes they're PhD students. And then we have a whole mini army of undergraduate research assistants that help us that we couldn't do the work without. Within the lab, we kind of do everything that runs the gamut from basic research to a basic laboratory research to going out in the field and collecting data. So kind of all along that continuum. So that keeps it exciting. My role, I mentor students. I serve on dissertation chair and master's thesis chairs, primarily because I am a research professor. Bringing in grant funding is a big thing, so that's another one of those things. And then, service activities, with UCF in terms of professional service and stuff like that.
Let's dive into your current research. What is the purpose of your research? What questions are you ultimately trying to answer? And why does it matter so much for modeling, simulation, and training?
So the purpose of all my research, kind of at a very high level, is try to better understand teams that are operating in complex environments. So what are the things that facilitate their performance? What are some of the things that may cause them maybe not to perform as well as they could? So that's kind of the overall goal, is to better help those kinds of teams. And better understand them. Our most recent research, we have a big chunk that we've been doing for NASA across several different projects over the last 10 to 15 years, where really the focus there is as they try to send crews to Mars, is where we started. Can we better understand kind of the team dynamics and how the multitude of stressors that they're now going to face? They won't be able to see Earth, big communication lags, periods of autonomy versus, sometimes they have more autonomy than not, depending on where they would be in that journey. Multicultural crews. So can we look at all these different types of environmental aspects, and how is that going to impact how the crew works together, with the idea of what can we do to help them, because they're going to have to be more resilient, because they're not going to always have that reach back capability that they tended to have. So that's a big thing that we've been focusing on. We also, we do some work from the Army recently, looking at on team composition and how can we facilitate that, so that it's not just about can you do your job related skills, but if we're talking about putting people in teams or units within the Army, then it takes I can't just be good at my job, at my task, right? I need to also be able to coordinate with those people around me that I need to. So we've been looking into some of that. And I guess the last thing I'll mention is we're also doing some work, which I'm really excited about. It's part of an Alacrity Center that's an NIH center. And we're collaborating with researchers out at UC San Diego, so University of California, San Diego. And what's really exciting is that I'm getting to take what we know about team science and translate it to a different domain. So these are researchers that are looking at children's mental health, and they're clinical psychologists. And so they go in and take evidence-based practices, and how can we improve, the treatment of kids with autism or some other types of mental health, children's mental health issues. And so it's really exciting being able to take what we do and then say, okay, so how can we take what we know about teams and what makes them effective, and how can we integrate that into the work that they're doing, so that these implementation teams, the ones that are taking what they know, hey, here are some things that we know helps kids with autism, for example. How can we take what we know and make those teams that are delivering those interventions more successful, so that there are better outcomes? So that's pretty exciting. I think most of what we do, how it relates back, is from a team's perspective. Through our research, we find out kind of what some of the foundational knowledge that's needed, right? But also what are some of the challenges that we face as we talk about whatever the different context is, whether it's Army teams or NASA teams, or we've done some work within the energy sector. So, where is it that teams might break down, right? So then we can take that knowledge and we can work with the developers and stuff from modeling and simulation to say, hey, this is the type of content, these are the type of scenarios, and help build out that content that goes into the modeling and simulation from a training perspective. And I think especially for the areas that I tend to focus on when we're talking about really complex environments, that's really important, because oftentimes, you want to, if we can build up that knowledge and build up that expertise with an environment that's, safe, right? The modeling instrument, then, that better equips them before they go out and actually do their jobs.
Now, how do you define success when studying teams operating under extreme conditions? And with the recent successful mission of Artemis, is that a good example of high stakes and team operations that might benefit from the research you are doing?
Yeah, I think to me, success in our work is when I actually see that we see the impact, right? So we see somebody's using it. It's not just sitting up on a shelf somewhere, right? So to me, that's success. And, that's one of the things that I really enjoy about the work we do, is because I like basic science, but most of what we do is dealing with applied problems. So being that someone's saying, hey, we have this issue and we can actually help with that issue. To me, that's really exciting. Yeah, I think spaceflight teams, that's an excellent example of some of the high stake teams that we tend to look at. So, one of the things that you guys had thought about was, what does team performance in complex and high stakes environments, what is that? And I think in the context of our work, it refers to, we deal with teams. So that's two or more people that are really working together. They're interdependent. So they need to rely on one another to accomplish their task. So that's the first part of it. They're working towards some type of shared goal. The complexity, I think, comes in driven by a number of things. and I'm not going to be able to mention all of them, but the dynamic nature of the work and the environment that they're operating in, the fact that oftentimes these teams aren't stable, so members may rotate in and out. The teams are often multifunctional, multidisciplinary, right? So people are kind of, in some ways, speaking different languages sometimes when we come in. So all that kind of stuff drives the complexity of these environments, the fluidity of the environments, and they're environments in which I'd argue that in order for these teams to be successful, they really have to be able to adapt and be resilient as environment and as team dynamics and team characteristics are kind of changing. The high stakes side, I mean, that might be obvious, but the high stake environments deal with, those environments where when I make a mistake, it has really high consequences, right? So we can think some environments that if I make a mistake, I'm like, okay, I'm a student. If I make a mistake, there are consequences, but they're relatively small in the bigger scheme of things, right? But if I'm an astronaut and I make a mistake and I'm out in space, that can be kind of a big deal, right? So the high stakes environments are those environments where mistakes have high consequences, and sometimes the consequences can even be life or death. And so, again, at the end of the day, within those really mission critical high stakes, it's important to try to understand how is it that those teams can adapt and learn and kind of be resilient so that they catch and learn from those mistakes so that they don't propagate.
Expanding on that, in addition to your work with other national security organizations like the Army, your work includes NASA analog environments like HERA and CIRRUS. What kinds of insights are emerging from these studies?
Well, we've had a couple of projects where we've collected data in one or both of those analog environments, and I'll briefly talk about two of them, and some of the insights. So, one of the projects that we had was looking at roles within teams. And we know that there are these formal roles, right? You're the commander, you're the mission specialist, or the doctor, right? But there are also these informal roles that emerge within teams. So one thing that we were interested in is these informal roles that emerge. Do those, when we start thinking about long duration space flight, are they similar to what we see in traditional organizations? Are they different? What's their relationship, to performance? And so within that project, we were able to identify a set of task-related roles. So these are roles that facilitate task accomplishment, as well as a set of roles that facilitate kind of social interaction, the bonding, the cohesion within crews. And a lot of them were similar, but we also found some that were different. And one of those is this notion of an entertainer. So we talk a lot about a jokester within traditional organizational teams, someone that can relieve that tension, right? And there's a balance there. You don't want someone doing that all the time, but there's a balance. But within NASA, it was much broader than that. It was more about entertainment, right? And jokes might be part of that, but there's also musical entertainment and stuff like that. So that was a little bit different. We also found that these informal roles, they tend to be distributed throughout the team. So everybody's kind of engaging at them. Sometimes they switch who's doing it based on workload, as an example. We also have found that there's a lot of focus on kind of these task roles, right? So what do we need to do in terms of facilitating task accomplishment? And you can think of like the person that is kind of the devil's advocate on the team, right? Or the person that always is willing to jump in and finish whatever needs to be done. But there's also this other side, this social side. And we found that within these NASA teams, that as mission duration gets longer and within these more isolated, confined environments, that those social roles really begin to take on much more importance than in traditional organizations. Now, that doesn't mean the task roles aren't important. I'm not saying that. But the social side becomes much more important, and we often kind of neglect those and don't pay attention to those. We've also found out how some of these roles or the importance of the roles may vary based on the types of stressors that they're experiencing or the stage in the mission. Is it early in the mission or late in the mission? So those are some of the other findings that have come out of that work. We've also done some work on team leadership and this notion of, we often talk about hierarchical top-down leadership, but there's also this notion of shared leadership or leadership that's kind of distributed throughout the team. And it goes back to oftentimes when we've got complexity in the environment, there's no one person that can do all leadership functions, right? So shared leadership kind of takes advantage of this idea that we can distribute it throughout the team and take advantage of different people's expertise with regards to different types of leadership functions, or sometimes it's because, hey, we both have really, someone's got a high workload, so it might be, so it gets distributed for different reasons. But we were looking at this notion of shared leadership within the context of long duration space flight. And so we did see that actually this occurred quite often, right? You still have your hierarchical leader, you have that top down leadership, but you also have many of these functions that kind of get distributed throughout the team. And that when that happened, it tended to facilitate teamwork. It tended to facilitate cohesion or bonding with the team, as well as team effectiveness. And we see that over time, because it takes a little bit of time to build this stuff up, right? Because I've got to, if we're going to share leadership functions and they're going to be taken on by multiple people within the team, then, I probably need to trust that you know what you're doing, right? Because leadership, I can't lead if someone's not following. Mm-hmm. So we also found that as shared leadership becomes more prevalent, as there's more trust, as trust builds up within the team, as the team believes that they have more belief in their abilities as a team, and when they have a better idea of who has what expertise on the team, that all those things kind of foster that. We also found some things that enable shared leadership to happen. So those things that, we might want to focus on. So some of it is, focus on maybe when we're selecting people. So first of all, it's like having a moderate level of motivation to lead. So someone actually wants to motivate. You don't want everybody to have a real high level, because that can be challenging. Social intelligence is important because it helps you to read those situations. And then having a degree of tolerance for ambiguity, because again, you're talking about leadership being distributed, which means at times it might be in flux. And then openness to experience was another thing that we found to be important to facilitate that type of leadership.
Shifting to team dynamics, how does diversity within teams, such as international space crews, impact performance and cohesion? You've also looked at long-duration analogs like Antarctic teams. What similarities exist between those and the space crews?
Yeah, I think, the Antarctic cruise, that's one of the analogs that NASA uses for their space crews, for people that do research on that. And, I think especially we tended to do Antarctic cruise during the winter over months. Yeah. And so when you look at that, both of those sets of contexts, if you will, they're isolated, they're confined. Some of the Antarctic stations, once you're there. You're not, they're extreme conditions. Both of those, you can probably picture that. And I think another thing that I was thinking about is that for the most part, I think within both of those domains, I think overall people choose to be there. And both of those settings, I think from what I've seen anyway, lots of people apply. So those, I think, are some of the similarities. Yeah. They're the analogs for NASA mostly because of that. They mimic some of those same conditions, the isolation, confinement, the extreme. And in terms of cultural diversity, what we found within some of the stuff that we did on that project, that one we did not look at teams down in the Antarctic. Okay. It was mostly in the analog environments. But we ended up with crews that were kind of low to moderate in diversity. And what we had done is we worked with NASA to we had a number of cultural values that we thought would impact how teams work together. Mm-hmm. So we worked with NASA to help to try to compose crews that were culturally diverse on those aspects. Yeah. And then, we looked at how those things impacted how the teams worked together, and what were some of the things that they did to transmit cultural knowledge within the crew. And we did see that those cultural values, they did impact how the crews worked together. Some of the things, and let me see if I can translate this. So some of the things we found was crew members that were more collectivistic in nature. So they value doing things for the good of the group, as opposed to just like, hey, look at me, being very kind of individualistic. What we see is that the more collectivistic people they were less likely to see fault lines or divides within the crew. And that's important, because when those divides, they often exist, but when they become salient, then we see problems with information sharing and trust and other things. So that's a good point. We also saw that as people who were more uncomfortable with uncertainty tended to perceive higher levels of identity with it. So they tended to identify with the other team members more. They tended to trust other team members more, and they rated teamwork as being higher, as perhaps maybe a way to reduce some of that uncertainty. And then, we also saw just some more general things that I think go back to kind of the idea of culture, but also the isolation and confinement of those settings. And we saw that the isolation may actually sharpen your ethnic background, which, can be a good thing because sometimes then that helps us to talk more about it, right? And then we begin to get past those stereotypes as we begin to learn about people. We also see that family metaphors, family dynamics, these teams that are isolated and confined over time tend to work much more like a family than like a traditional organizational team. So that's some of those things that, all those good and bad things that families do. And, we know that the impact of some of these cultural values, it changed over time. The other thing I think that was kind of interesting is we found kind of what crews did to transmit cultural knowledge, right? And one of the first things they told us is that don't judge a book by its cover, because sometimes they looked at someone and they thought they were just like them. And then they found that they really weren't, but it also worked the opposite way, right? Yeah. So, but some of the things that these crews did, which I thought were kind of cool. So, meals. So we hear a lot about that, using meals and food as a way to transmit and bond with other team members. But they would pick their TV shows and their movies to watch during their downtimes, and they'd make sure that there were cultural aspects to that so they could, kind of talk about that. They purposely picked music during their workout sessions that had different, cultural themes, if you will. And then I think the last thing that they did was sometimes language is an issue, right? When you start having multicultural crews, right? So some of the crews actually kind of formed language clubs, right? And there needs to be a certain degree of trust there, but they formed language clubs where they would begin to teach the other person or the other crew members the opposite language. And they did that in a number of different ways. So
as we look forward, how do you see AI influencing team training, performance, or decision-making in the future? What excites you the most about the intersection of AI and team dynamic research?
Goodness. So I think there's a wide variety of ways that AI could influence, right? I mean, the field is kind of wide open right now with possibilities. I think that a lot more research needs to be done, but I'll just some thoughts. So, I think it could potentially help from a training standpoint in making training more engaging, right? So helping it to better tailor to the person, whether it's, the manner in which they like to learn, or, I was even thinking about like even some of the images and stuff, just making them more interactive and exciting to different people. I think one of the things that excites me is AI as a teammate. And I mean a real teammate, not just a tool, but an actual teammate that can help back me up, that knows when I'm beginning to have trouble. I think we're a long way from there. I know there has been some work done in terms of AI as a coach. And I think that's another way that could come into training, right? More from a developmental standpoint and tailoring training maybe regarding your personal and cultural characteristics. I think in terms of decision making, obviously there are sensors and we all have more information. We get more information pushed to us than we can ever actually integrate, right, ourselves. So I think that's one place that AI could help, is in helping to weight and pull that information and helping the human to integrate it. And, maybe also projecting out, second and third order effects. Also, if we're talking about decision making, I think is another place. I think some of the things that excites me, I just came back from one of our professional conferences, and within the lab, we do quantitative work, but we also do a lot of qualitative work. And so we do a lot of qualitative coding of whether it's interviews or NASA journals. And qualitative coding takes a lot of time and a lot of legwork. And there was a session on AI helping with qualitative coding, and I think that's really exciting. At the point it is now, there's still some hallucinations, so there still needs to be the human involved. But I think it has the potential to, I don't know if the human will ever come all the way out, but definitely to reduce some of the burden, which I think is really exciting. And then going back to like the AI as teammate, and that makes me kind of think about some of the stuff we do, and looking at trust in AI. That's a huge thing, right? But I was also thinking about, what does it mean to be, we talk about cohesion in teams. What does it mean? Do I need to be cohesive? Do I need to bond with the AI? So just, I think there's some really interesting questions that can be posed.
On another note, can you talk about the importance of partnerships between IST and departments like yours in psychology?
Sure. So I think, partnerships are extremely important. I mean, we can't do the work that we do, especially anymore, without partners. Yeah. So, whether they're internal to UCF or external to UCF, I think, the value is, again, It gives you additional types of expertise, additional methodologies that you might not think about, especially if your partners are cross-discipline, different discipline than you, different viewpoints, which then can all kind of make that research stronger, because I think, sometimes we get narrow in our disciplines. And so if we have a cross-discipline or multidisciplinary team that are as our partners, right, that can make our research stronger. And then, partners provide access to resources, to networks, to space, to, and then, the partnership that I have with psychology, that's important to me, do the linkage to the graduate students. We could not perform the work that we do in the lab without the graduate students. And then, the same reason above, as what I talked about, it's also important because they're good colleagues. So having those networks and having those different perspectives to brainstorm ideas off of and stuff like that. And I think we've been really lucky, or I've been really lucky over my career so far, in that most of the partners that we've had are true partners, as opposed to just, partners in name only. So those are the partners you want, right?
That's great. As we come to a close, we always like to end on this question. What advice would you offer someone who is considering going into a similar career path as you? In particular, what would you tell someone that you wish someone had told you when you were deciding your future career?
Think about three things, but I might add a fourth. So, I think the first thing is, to be successful, you never stop learning. Don't ever stop learning. If you're going into academics, I would say choose your graduate students carefully. You mentor them, but you also learn so much from them. I think it's a two-way street. So you develop them, but I think conscientiousness is really big and huge for me when I look for graduate students, because on a day-to-day basis, they're the ones that keep the work moving. And ultimately, they're a representation of you as well as the school. So don't stop learning. Think about who you're working with carefully. The second thing, especially in this environment, is you need to learn how to handle feedback and rejection. We probably get rejected more than than we're successful. If you think about grant writing and submitting proposals to agencies, I know very few people that get it on the first time around. And same thing with publishing. You often get revised and resubmit. So, kind of taking that developmental approach and not taking that feedback personally, and knowing that even for those people that are very successful, it's often multiple iterations. The third thing I thought about was just the importance of partnerships. And I kind of already spoke to this before, but partnering often now involves combining multiple disciplines. So in doing that, when we're working with multiple disciplines, I think one thing that I would tell people is how important it is to make sure that you guys are on the same page. We talk about shared mental models within teams, but on the same page, you understand what the norms are going to be. You're going to understand, how you're going to work together. Try to be careful not to use jargon. I've had partners where we're actually saying the same word, coming from different disciplines, and means something totally different. So, just being clear about that. And I think the last thing I was going to add is learn to be flexible. My role here at IST is in many ways is fairly unique. I'm a professor, but I'm a research track professor, which means that my appointment is here at IST. Basically, my job functions really revolve around bringing grants in and doing research. I have students that help, support me in doing that. But those are my primary responsibilities, as opposed to being over on campus in a more traditional faculty role, where my responsibilities would be teaching. And, I do sometimes teach as an adjunct and stuff like that. But just keeping your options open and realizing that with most degrees, there's so many different things that you can do. And sometimes it's not the same track as everybody else is going down.
Before we sign off, where should our listeners go to find out more about your work at UCF?
So I guess there's two places. Number one is IST's homepage, which is www.ist.ucf.edu. And then the second page, the second area would be psychology's page, because I'm also listed there. And that's sciences.ucf.edu/psychology. And go to the People's tab.
With that, I would like to thank Shawn for joining us on here today. That's a wrap on this episode. Thank you for tuning in. Want to stay in the loop on what's happening in the modeling and simulation and Team Orlando communities? Head to teamorlando.org and follow us on LinkedIn, X, and Facebook for all the latest updates and upcoming events. If you're looking to spotlight your organization or share your voice on AIM on MS&T, sponsorship and guest opportunities are available. contact us. The information will be in the description. Don't forget to follow AIM on MS&T on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an episode. I will talk to you all in the next one. Bye!